At the edge of the forgotten village of Dramoor, where moss grew thicker than grass and the trees bowed like mourners at a gravesite, there lay a marsh that no map dared name. It was a place where mist clung low to the earth even in summer, where birds refused to sing and the moonlight touched nothing but the surface of water that never quite stood still. Locals called it the Whispering Marsh, though none could remember when the name first took root. The elders claimed it had always been called that, passed down like a curse with every hushed warning to keep away. The marsh seemed to breathe. It exhaled a sour, wet air that curdled the stomach and filled the lungs with heaviness. If you stood still long enough you'd hear it, not just the croaks of frogs or the hum of insects, but something subtler, quieter. A sound beneath the sounds. Whispering. Faint and broken like wind through reeds but not quite wind. Like words but not meant for living ears. The villagers never said it directly but all of them knew. The marsh was watching, listening and, sometimes, speaking back. They said the bubbles were the worst of it. Round and glistening, they would rise from beneath the muck, shimmering strangely in the light, sometimes glowing faintly with no source at all. Children who wandered too close claimed they heard voices in them, soft and urgent. Some heard cries, others laughter. But many heard names, familiar ones. Names of people they knew. Names of people who had vanished. And once, long ago, a child came running home, face pale and eyes wild, whispering the name of a woman none dared speak of. That woman's name was Elira. There were no records of her in the church ledgers, no marker in the graveyard. But her story was older than either. Passed through generations like a song no one wanted to sing, Elira was the girl who was drowned. The girl whose words were too sharp, too true. The girl who saw things she shouldn't have and spoke truths no one wanted to hear. The girl whose last breath rose to the surface in bubbles that refused to burst. No one knew all the details. The older folk gave differing accounts. Some said Elira accused the village headman of poisoning the well. Others claimed she uncovered the secret of a child gone missing, or that she had visions and dreams that revealed the sins of those in power. But all the tales agreed on one thing. They drowned her in the marsh to silence her, and the marsh never forgot. Now, long after that nameless act of cruelty, the marsh remained restless. Every few years, a new bubble would rise, too perfectly round, too slow to vanish. And every so often, someone would hear their own name and fall ill within days. People built their homes with their backs to the marsh. They didn't fetch water there. They didn't let their children play near its edges. The whispering had grown fainter over time, but it had never stopped. The village of Dramoor endured, but it never grew. Strangers rarely stayed long, sensing the unease that clung to the very soil. Travelers spoke of feeling watched as if unseen eyes peered through the reeds. And always the marsh loomed, still, silent and waiting. Those who dared walk near its banks sometimes said that just before a bubble rose, the water would quiver, not from wind or beast, but as though stirred by memory. As if the marsh itself remembered. Remembered the girl. Remembered the guilt. Remembered the truth buried beneath its surface. And the names still came. Not every day, not every week. But they came, floating up from the deep and glistening, unpoppable spheres, carrying with them a breath stolen long ago, whispering what the villagers dared not say aloud. Elira was born on the coldest night of the year, when the sky hung heavy with stars and the marsh steamed like a great sleeping beast beneath the moonlight. The midwife who delivered her claimed the wind paused in the trees the moment she took her first breath, as though the world itself was listening. She was a quiet baby, wide-eyed and alert, with a gaze that made even grown men feel strangely exposed, like she saw not their faces but the truths buried beneath them. From a young age, Elira displayed a kind of knowing that couldn't be taught. While other children played, she watched, the bend of branches in the wind, the way crows circled a sick house, the flicker in a person's eye before they spoke a lie. She never shouted or demanded attention, but when she spoke, people listened. Her voice was calm, soft, but carried the weight of certainty. She didn't guess. She simply knew. Her connection to nature was unlike anything the villagers had seen. Animals were drawn to her. Cats followed her like shadows, birds landed on her shoulders without fear, and even the surly village dogs wagged their tails when she passed. But it was water that loved her most. She could find springs no one else knew existed. She'd sit for hours by the brook with her feet in the current, whispering to it as though it could hear her, and maybe it did because the water always seemed clearer where she touched it, cooler, more alive. In the marsh, where no one else dared tread, Elira would sometimes walk the edges in silence, watching the surface ripple as if in conversation. She was the daughter of a healer, her mother known for mixing poultices and remedies from the herbs that grew near the marsh's edge. Her father had died before she was old enough to remember him, and the village had always kept a polite distance from the two of them, respectful but wary. The healer's family was tolerated but never truly trusted. It had always been that way in Dromore. The village was built on old beliefs, governed by old men, and held together by unspoken rules. One did not ask questions that made others uncomfortable. One did not speak truths that could upset the order. And one certainly did not listen to the marsh. But Elira was not bound by silence. Her first public vision came when she was 12. A child had gone missing, and the search parties were scouring the woods in vain. Elira stood in the village square and calmly said, "He is beneath the roots of the twisted elm near the east path." People laughed. Some scolded her. But when they checked, they found him, alive, tangled but safe, just where she said he'd be. After that, the elders tried to dismiss her as lucky. But more visions followed. Illnesses she predicted days before the symptoms showed. A barn fire foreseen in a dream. A man's death foretold in a single sentence. He shouldn't go near the well on the third morning. It would have been easier if she had used her gift for flattery or convenience. But Elira didn't bend her truths to comfort. She spoke plainly and without malice, but always with precision. When she saw someone stealing grain from the communal storehouse, she named them. When she overheard whispered threats behind closed doors, she repeated them. When the headman's son lied about harming a stray animal, Elira said, "You did it, and you smiled while it suffered." And no one could meet her eyes afterward. The elders grew uneasy. She was not like other girls who were expected to learn silence and subservience. Elira questioned decisions. She pointed out inconsistencies. She asked why women couldn't vote in the village council, why children were punished for curiosity, why no one ever spoke of the marsh's past. Her questions made people uncomfortable, and discomfort in Dromore was treated like a contagion. Whispers began to rise. That she was meddling in things best left alone. That she was too clever, too strange. Some called her a witch, though not loudly. Others simply said she would have been better off born a boy. Her mother warned her gently to hold her tongue, to be cautious, but Elira only smiled. "If I don't say it," she said, "the truth still exists. Better to speak it than let it rot in silence." The village tolerated her for a time as long as her truths remained small, harmless, even helpful. But as she grew older, her visions turned toward the heart of Dromore's rot. She began seeing things she wasn't meant to know, things the elders had buried deep and hoped forgotten. Secrets that stained the roots of the village like poison. And once Elira saw them, she could not unsee. Nor could she stay silent. And so the murmurs grew louder. Not of awe or admiration but of fear. The elders met in hushed gatherings. The headman's face turned tight whenever Elira passed. And the marsh, ever listening, seemed to stir with something ancient and expectant, as if it too knew what was coming. It began with a ledger. Elira had been helping her mother gather herbs near the southern border of Dromore, beyond the gnarled birch trees where the earth turned soft and the stones seemed to whisper beneath one's feet. There, half buried under an overgrown patch of nettle and vine, she spotted the broken remains of a leather-bound book. Its spine was crumbling and mold laced its corners, but the ink inside, oddly, remained legible. She felt the breath of the marsh stir as she touched it, a sudden gust that made the trees tremble and the hair on her arms rise. Inside the book were entries written in a precise, practiced hand. Transactions. Names. Signatures. But the pages told a different story than the one she'd been raised to believe. According to the village's history, the land around the marsh had always been common ground, untouched, unowned, a sacred barrier between the world of the living and the forgotten. But here, in careful script, were records of a sale. The land had been divided and sold off, not for public benefit but for private profit. Among the names signed in ink were the current village headman, 3 of the oldest council members, and a merchant who had mysteriously vanished 2 decades prior. Worse still, the dates matched the year the river shifted course and the crops began failing. The elders had always blamed bad weather and poor soil, but Elira saw now, it had all started with the marsh. Something had been disturbed, something that should have remained untouched. And the truth had been hidden behind lies and ledgers and the quiet disappearance of anyone who asked too many questions. As she turned the pages, the air seemed to thicken around her. A low sound, like a groan or a sigh, echoed from the marsh. Elira stood, suddenly aware that the trees had gone silent, the wind held back. The world was listening again. She could have hidden the book. She could have stayed silent, tucked the knowledge away like a dangerous relic and gone on with her life. But Elira had never been made for silence. She brought the ledger to the village square during the next market day, when every family was gathered to trade goods and gossip. Standing atop the old well, she read from the book aloud, voice clear, eyes steady. She named names. She read dates. She told them how the land that had once belonged to everyone had been stolen for the benefit of a few. How those in power had lied, had shifted blame, had buried the truth, along with anyone who got too close to it. The crowd went still. Then came the murmurs. Disbelief. But no denial. And then something stranger. As she spoke, a sudden wind tore through the square, whipping scarves from heads and overturning baskets. A flock of crows, dozens, descended from the sky and circled above, cawing loudly as if echoing her words. One landed on the well beside her, staring with an unblinking eye. The others perched on rooftops and chimneys, watching, listening. Later that night, the village would speak of cracked mirrors, shattered without warning in homes near the council hall. Dogs howled and refused to eat. Fires refused to catch or flared too high and too fast. One woman said her child woke from a nightmare screaming, "The water knows. The water sees." And through it all, Elira remained calm. She began holding gatherings near the edge of the marsh, inviting anyone who wished to listen. There, she told them not just of the land and the betrayal, but of the dreams she had begun having. Visions of the marsh before it was disturbed, of figures with hollow eyes sinking beneath the surface, of voices bubbling up through water thick with sorrow. She spoke of a wrong still alive beneath the earth, pulsing like a wound that never healed. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. Where had the merchant gone? Why had the priestess before the current one vanished without a trace? What happened to the girl? Elira hesitated to say her own name, who had been drowned generations ago. Some villagers grew afraid. Others angry. A few started asking questions of their own. But the elders, seated in their wide stone hall like statues too heavy to move, said nothing. Not publicly. Behind closed doors their voices were not so still. "She's dangerous," muttered one. "She's stirring old things," said another. "She's a child," someone tried to argue, but the words lacked conviction. They remembered what had happened before, how one voice could unravel everything. The marsh had taken the last truth-teller, and even that hadn't silenced the whispers. Now the past was returning in the form of a girl with clear eyes and a sharper tongue. The council could not afford another reckoning. They began meeting more frequently, never during daylight. Lights were seen flickering in the old granary well past midnight. Riders were sent to distant towns, why no one knew. And still Elira kept speaking. She began to notice people watching her. Not the curious or the loyal, those she welcomed, but others. Men who didn't speak. Faces that disappeared the moment she turned to look. Her mother grew anxious, warning her to be careful, to perhaps rest, to stay inside for a time. But Elira shook her head. If they feared truth, she said, they should not have buried it in shallow ground. The dreams worsened. She saw herself in them now, not as she was but standing ankle-deep in the marsh, hair loose, eyes glowing, hands outstretched. The water rippled and from it rose faces, familiar, lost, half-formed. They whispered not in fear but in longing. Just as they said, "Remember us." One night, she woke to find the mirror beside her bed cracked clean down the middle. The surface no longer showed her reflection. Instead, it showed the marsh, still and endless, with one perfect bubble rising toward the surface. She knew then. The elders wouldn't wait much longer. Something was coming. And like all things in Dramor, it would begin and end with the marsh. It happened on a night thick with fog, so heavy it blanketed the village like a shroud, muffling sound and softening shape. No stars pierced the sky, and the moon, hidden behind a curtain of cloud, offered no light to guide the way. It was a silence that pressed in from all sides, broken only by the wet shuffle of boots over earth and the faint rustle of cloaks in the mist. Elira didn't scream. She knew better than to waste breath on ears that had chosen deafness long ago. They came for her as she walked the wooded path back from her gathering by the marsh. 4 of them, faces hidden behind scarves and shadows, each one carrying the weight of fear disguised as righteousness. They didn't speak her name. They didn't need to. She had seen this moment in her dreams too many times to mistake it for anything else. Their hands were rough and silent. She struggled, but they were stronger. Not a word was exchanged. Not a warning. Not a plea. Just the sound of her feet dragging through mud, her breath misting in the cold, and the hush of the fog swallowing it all. The marsh greeted them without resistance. Its waters were still waiting. The mist curled low across its surface like fingers reaching upward. Frogs fell silent. Even the crickets refused to sing. The men led her to the water's edge with practiced steps, as if they had been here before, as if this path had been laid for them by old, unspoken traditions. Elira turned to face them, her hair tangled with leaves, her eyes clear despite the bruises forming beneath them. She said nothing at first. Then, just as they reached the dark water, she whispered not to them but to the marsh itself. "You remember," she said. "You always do." That gave one of the men pause. His grip loosened. But another stepped forward, murmuring, "It must be done. She's cursed this place long enough." Elira's laugh was soft and strange. "I didn't curse it," she said. "You did, the moment you drowned the truth." They pushed her into the shallows. The water was freezing, rising quickly to her knees, then waist. She stumbled but kept her head high. The reeds parted around her, almost reverently. For a moment the fog thinned, and one might have thought the marsh itself was holding its breath. One of the men waded in after her. Rough hands again. A struggle. A splash. And then she was pulled beneath. There was no scream. Just a sudden glow. The water, dark and thick, lit from within as her body sank. A trail of bubbles rose from where she disappeared, perfect, round, and luminous. They shimmered with a pale light, like moonlit pearls drifting toward the surface. And from them came a sound, faint but unmistakable, singing. A tune with no words, older than the village, older than the guilt buried in its soil. The melody carried sorrow but also warning. It echoed through the trees, reached into the hearts of those standing at the shore, and refused to be forgotten. The men backed away shaken. One stumbled to his knees. Another crossed himself and fled into the fog without a word. The remaining two stood in silence, watching the bubbles rise, their faces pale and drawn. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light dimmed. The water returned to stillness. The song faded. Elira was gone. By morning, the fog remained, hanging heavy over Dramor like a judgment not yet passed. The elders convened swiftly, not in panic, but with the cold precision of men who had rehearsed this moment. Word was spread that Elira had drowned by accident, perhaps lost in the mist, wandered too close to the edge. The healer, her mother, was told with eyes cast downward. There was no search party. No burial. No service. "It is a tragedy," the headman said, his voice flat. "A girl too curious for her own good." But those who lived near the marsh spoke in hushed tones. Of the lights they saw that night. Of the song that had carried on the wind. Of the bubbles that still rose from the center of the water long after the girl had vanished. The elders forbade any mention of Elira. Her gatherings were disbanded. The ledger she had found vanished from her mother's home. Her name was struck from the town rolls, her memory sealed beneath layers of carefully constructed silence. But the marsh did not forget. In the days that followed, the bubbles continued. Not many, not often. Just one at a time. Rising slow, glowing soft. And sometimes, if one stood very still, they could hear a single note trailing behind them, gentle, mournful, and impossible to ignore. And though the village turned its face from the truth, though the elders tightened their grip, the marsh had taken her not as a victim but as a witness. The water had accepted her, and with her final breath, Elira had given it what it had long been denied, voice. The elders thought they had silenced her. But her story was only just beginning. At first, the bubbles came as they always had, silent, slow, and strange. But after Elira's drowning, something changed. They rose more often, breaking the surface of the marsh in the early hours of morning or just after dusk. They drifted not randomly but with eerie purpose, gliding across the water like they were searching for something. Or someone. And for the first time in generations, the villagers heard what they had long feared. The bubbles were whispering. It began with a murmur, soft, too faint to catch, like a breath lost in wind. But soon the words grew clearer. Names. Spoken one at a time, in a voice that did not belong to any living soul. Sometimes it was Elira's voice, light and haunting. Other times it was a chorus, low and layered, as if spoken by many mouths at once, all saying the same thing. The first name was whispered at dawn, just as the mist curled low over the thatched roofs of the village. Thomel, one of the younger men who had stood guard for the council, was found shivering outside his home, eyes wide with terror. He claimed the bubble floated across the surface of the marsh and hovered for a moment just inches from his face. He didn't run. He couldn't. The voice, Elira's voice, he said, had called his name not in anger but in sorrow. He left that same night and was never seen again. Then came the second. Branwick, an elder councilman, once known for his proud posture and steady voice, began locking himself inside his home. He boarded his windows. He stuffed herbs into the cracks in the walls. "She knows," he muttered to anyone who came near. She sees me when I close my eyes. In the mirror. In the water. Even in the damn rain puddles. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Villagers heard him screaming at nothing in the middle of the night. And then one morning he was gone too. His door hanging open, a single wet footprint leading away from the hearth, out into the woods. A neighbor later found his walking stick floating near the edge of the marsh. The whispers grew bolder after that. Villagers began reporting strange sightings. Bubbles that floated up from their wells, or drifted along the river that ran past the village mill. Some claimed to see their own reflections within the orbs, distorted and blurred as if viewed through tears. Others swore they heard more than names. Fragments of conversations, secrets they thought long buried, promises broken under moonlight. And always, the animals knew before the people did. Dogs barked at empty corners. Cats hissed at still air. The cattle refused to drink from the village troughs. Horses grew skittish, eyes rolling white whenever a bubble came near. Even the crows, those ancient watchers of the marsh, began to roost farther away, their usual perches abandoned as if in mourning or fear. Children cried at night, clutching their blankets as if warding off some unseen presence. One girl insisted a bubble floated through her open window and hovered above her bed, whispering something she didn't understand. Her mother found her feverish and pale, her small hands clenched around a river stone she claimed the bubble had left behind. The stone was slick with moisture, yet the room was bone dry. The crops too began to falter. Not in the usual way, no rot, no worms, no blight, but simply in refusal. Seeds wouldn't sprout. Fruit dropped green and bitter. Fields that once yielded golden wheat now offered nothing but silence. The village priest, a man who had never spoken against the council in his life, stood up during a sermon and said, "The land is refusing us. It remembers what we did." The church was empty the next week. Among the elders, panic quietly bloomed. They tried to downplay it at first, calling it hysteria, bad dreams, coincidence. But behind closed doors they knew. They met in secret again, though fewer in number now. Their voices were hushed, their arguments circular. There was no solution. The act could not be undone, and the truth could no longer be buried. One elder, Havin, the oldest among them, finally broke. It began one evening when he stumbled into the square barefoot, soaked from head to toe though it hadn't rained in days. He was laughing, but his eyes shone with a fear that chilled the spine. "She came to me," he said. "Not in a dream. Not in thought. In the water. Her face, she's not angry but she's waiting. And the water, oh gods, the water knows." He began to speak to the air, pointing at things no one could see. "She's standing there by the well. She watches with eyes full of questions we never answered. She's still asking. She'll always be asking." They took him home, locked the door, posted a guard. By morning he was gone. The guard said he never heard a thing. Just a soft gurgle like bubbling water. When they opened the door, they found Havin's bed empty, a trail of wet footprints leading across the floor and stopping at the wall. There was a single bubble resting on the windowsill, unmoving as though waiting to be noticed. After that, no one spoke Elira's name aloud, but her presence grew more powerful than ever. The marsh no longer needed to be near to be felt. Its voice traveled in mist, in wells, in dreams. The people whispered of judgment, of reckoning. And those with clean consciences stayed close to their homes, lit candles at their doors and muttered prayers into the night. But the guilty, they were never truly alone. They walked with shadows behind them, reflections that didn't quite match, and the growing dread that someday soon, a bubble would rise with their name on its breath. The marsh, once a place of forgotten sorrow, had become something else entirely. It was no longer waiting. It was remembering, calling, speaking. And Elira, the girl they drowned to silence, had found a voice louder than death. It did not happen all at once. The guilty fell not like soldiers in battle, but like dying leaves, one by one, quietly, with the inevitability of rot. Some vanished without a trace, others met fates so strange and twisted that no one could explain them without glancing over their shoulder. But no matter how it happened, the villagers began to understand. The marsh was not finished. The first was Eldon. A younger man but tied to the council through blood. He was the headman's nephew, always watching the edge of things, always listening where he shouldn't. He'd laughed at Elira during her final days, even mocked the bubbles rising from the marsh. He disappeared on a clear morning. Left his tools in the field mid-swing. His wife found his coat hanging neatly on their door, still damp. Days later, a fisherman pulling traps at the river's bend found something strange tangled in the reeds. A shoe, split at the sole and filled with mud. Beneath it, the water swirled as if something had just been there. The second was Morel, the apothecary's son, who had helped carry Elira's body the night they dragged her to the marsh. He claimed he had been forced, that he had tried to turn away. But guilt does not care for apologies made too late. Morel began to hear voices. Not whispers, but sharp, clear words spoken from nowhere. You knew. You watched. You could have stopped them. He closed his shop, shuttered the windows, and refused visitors. On the seventh day the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the shelves had been smashed, glass scattered across the floor like tiny frozen tears. Morel was never found. A single trail of wet footprints led from his back room to the hearth and then vanished. By the time the third elder died, people had stopped calling them accidents. Eleanor, a former council member, had resigned after Elira's death and kept mostly to herself. Some said she had begged the others not to go through with it, but her silence afterward sealed her place among the guilty. One evening she was seen standing at the edge of the marsh, barefoot, her arms lifted as though in prayer. No one dared approach. When she didn't return home, her daughter searched the banks and found only a circle of reeds bent flat, as if someone had been standing in the water, surrounded by dozens of perfectly round bubbles that had not yet popped. The bubbles grew more frequent. Some hovered inches above the marsh, refusing to rise further, as though they were waiting to be seen. Others traveled with the wind, drifting into the village like lanterns made of breath and memory. And always they whispered names, soft, insistent, undeniable. Villagers began referring to the phenomenon in hushed tones. The marsh's mouth. It was as if the water itself had found a tongue. The marsh's mouth is open, they said when a new name was heard. And it is hungry. A kind of sickness took root in Dramor, not of body but of soul. The village split not by geography but by fear. Those who believed Elira had been wronged, the younger folk, the quiet ones, the healers and dreamers, kept candles burning in her memory, spoke of her with reverence, and left wildflowers at the edge of the marsh as offerings. They whispered prayers to the water, asking for protection, for guidance, even for forgiveness. But others, those with old loyalties and deeper secrets, clung to denial like a cloak. They refused to speak her name, closed their curtains tighter at night, and walked the streets with salt in their pockets and iron pins at their throats. They muttered about witches and curses, claiming Elira had brought this upon them by meddling in matters beyond her station. They blamed her mother, her followers, the marsh itself, anything but their own guilt. The village square, once a place of gathering and trade, grew eerily quiet. Shops remained shuttered, doors stayed locked even during daylight, and no one ventured near the water after dusk. When the wind blew from the marsh, carrying with it the faint sound of singing or names half-formed, people froze in place, eyes wide as if waiting to hear their own name next. And always the animals watched. Dogs whimpered and refused to cross the main road leading to the marsh. The birds that once filled the skies with song now gathered in great flocks, circling high above as if waiting for something to rise. The marsh itself seemed to expand, not physically but spiritually. Its presence reached beyond its borders, creeping into dreams, into mirrors, into the dark places behind the eyes. No one knew how many were truly guilty. Some confessed privately, seeking comfort or absolution from others who dared not judge. But the marsh did not wait for confessions. No. And it chose. There were those who claimed they saw Elira walking the banks in the fog. Not a ghost exactly, more a shadow, a presence that turned mist to memory. They said she did not look angry. She looked knowing. And that was worse. For anger could be reasoned with. But knowing, meant there was no more pretending. The headman stopped appearing in public altogether. Some said he was ill. Others claimed the marsh had begun speaking directly to him through his walls, whispering in the creaks of the floorboards, showing him things in puddles that reflected no sky. His house stood quiet, save for the occasional flicker of candlelight and the slow rhythmic knock of something against the wood, like dripping water. What had once been a single crime had unraveled the fabric of the village. Trust eroded. Families turned inward. Friends avoided eye contact. And through it all, the bubbles kept rising, each one a message, a breath, a name. The villagers no longer asked whether the marsh was cursed. They asked when it would speak their name. The village had almost forgotten how to hope when she appeared. It was on a damp morning, the kind where the fog clings stubbornly to the earth and the sky is a pale smear of gray. At first she was just another traveler, silent, solitary, moving like a shadow between the houses. But those who caught a glimpse stopped in their tracks, a strange catch in their breath, as if the past had stepped into the present. She looked like Elira. Not the pale, fragile girl who had drowned in the marsh, but strong, fierce, with eyes that held storms and secrets. Her hair was the same dark cascade that had once caught the sun's fading light by the riverbank. Her voice carried the same clear, unwavering tone. Some whispered that she was Elira's sister, returned from distant lands to carry on the fight. Others murmured more cautiously of reincarnation, an ancient soul come back to unbind the village's tangled lies. Whatever her origin, the stranger, who called herself Leora, wasted no time. She went straight to the youth of the village, gathering them in secret beneath the tallest oak in the square, where the roots tangled deep like the stories they were about to unravel. She spoke not only with words but with a presence that pulled the children, the restless young, closer, as if the marsh itself had sent her. Leora listened to the marsh. She sat by its edge for hours, eyes closed, hands lightly touching the water, feeling the tremors beneath its surface. Where the villagers heard only whispers, she heard songs, fragments of memory carried on bubbles, echoes of voices long silenced, and the sharp sting of truth. One evening, beneath a sky heavy with stars, she gathered the youth once more. She told them of an ancient rite, one spoken of only in old folktales, a ceremony meant to awaken the marsh's full voice. The rite was dangerous, forbidden by the elders who feared what might be uncovered. But Leora insisted that the only way to heal was to hear everything, to let the truth rise and settle like the water after a storm. The children, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope, followed her to the heart of the marsh. There, amid reeds thick and whispering, Leora began the rite. She sang in a language older than the village itself, her voice weaving through the night air like a thread pulling the past and present together. The marsh responded. Bubbles rose thick and fast, glowing with an eerie light, carrying voices clearer than ever before. From those shimmering orbs came the full tapestry of truth, unspooling like a dark thread through the village's history. It told of a land deal hidden beneath layers of lies, where greed had poisoned the heart of the council. It revealed how promises made in secret had been broken with ruthless cruelty. It spoke of a betrayal so deep that to silence it, they had drowned not only Elira but the hope she carried. The voices named names, some familiar, some whispered only in fear. They spoke of fear disguised as loyalty, of power wielded like a blade behind closed doors. But amid the harsh truths there was something else, a call for reckoning, a plea for change. The village listened, stunned and silent, as the bubbles sang through the night. And for the first time since Elira's death, they heard not just sorrow or accusation, but a path forward, one where the marsh's voice could no longer be ignored, and where truth might finally wash away the darkness. As dawn broke over the village, an uneasy stillness hung in the air, heavy and expectant as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The marsh, which had long seemed a silent witness to the village's secrets, began to stir in a way no one had seen before. The water, dark and deep, crept beyond its banks with a slow, deliberate movement, flooding the low fields and creeping toward the edge of the village itself. At first, the villagers watched with wide eyes and pounding hearts. They saw the water swallow the cracked fences and the worn footpaths, creeping into gardens where children once played. It was as if the marsh was alive, claiming what had been taken from it and demanding its due. Then came the unmistakable signs. The bubbles, the ever-present messengers, grew larger, rising thick and fast from the expanding waters. Their whispered names no longer carried fear or sorrow, but a finality that echoed through the village streets like a tolling bell. One by one, those who had avoided judgment were overtaken by the flood, caught in the rising water, disappearing beneath the surface as if the marsh had reached out with invisible hands to pull them into its depths. Some resisted, but the marsh was relentless. The guilty, those whose names had been carried in the bubbles and spoken by the voices in the mist, found no refuge. The water did not discriminate, it consumed all that remained, swallowing whole the last remnants of deceit and betrayal. The village elders who had once ruled with harsh silence were gone, their empty homes standing like tombstones against the gray sky. With the passing of the flood, the whispers ceased. The bubbles no longer carried names or voices. The marsh was quiet once more but not empty. At its very heart, where the waters ran deepest and darkest, a single new tree had sprung, tall and strong, its leaves shimmering with an otherworldly light. Villagers said it was Elira's spirit, finally at rest and transformed into something living and enduring. The tree stood as a symbol, a silent promise that the truth would no longer be hidden beneath the surface. Around it, the swamp seemed to breathe more gently, its restless energy replaced by a calm that spread slowly through the land. The survivors, those who had not been consumed by the flood, gathered beneath the tree. Their faces were etched with grief and relief, their voices hushed but determined. They vowed to remember the truth Elira had revealed, to honor her sacrifice by rebuilding the village on a foundation of honesty and justice. No longer would silence or fear rule their lives. Instead, they would carry the stories, the names, and the lessons like sacred seeds, planting them deep so that future generations would know both the cost of betrayal and the power of truth. And so, the marsh, once a place of sorrow and shadows, became a guardian of memory, a place where the past and present met, and where Elira's voice, carried on the breeze and in the rustle of leaves, would never again be drowned out.